SLT Mobitel, the connection. SLT Mobitel, the connection.
ලෙන්ගතුකම වැඩි කරගන්න ලව්ජු රුපියල් 50ට අඩු කළා.
මාමේ එන්න අපිට එකක් බොමු.
Tonight, it's here. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa officially receives the Indian donation of the COVID-19 vaccine.
We are very grateful to His Excellency the President, who very graciously was at the airport when the consignment was handed over to the government of Sri Lanka.
Inoculations will kick off tomorrow. Mega leap. Sri Lanka breaks yesterday's record of highest single-day COVID recoveries as the island ranks among the top 10 countries to have handled the pandemic effectively. Allegations galore. UN Human Rights Chief officially releases scathing report on Sri Lanka, calls for the island to be referred to the International Criminal Court. Black mark. Former Sri Lanka cricketer found guilty under the ICC Anti-Corruption Code. All that and much more coming up on First at 9, this Thursday the 28th of January 2021.
Buy a 2-litre Coke and get a glass free.
ඇල්කොහොල් අඩංගු hand sanitizer භාවිත කරන්න. ලෙඩ රෝග ඇති කරන විෂ බීජවලට එරෙහිව සටන් කරන්න. හඳුන්වා දීමේ මිල රුපියල් 350යි.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to First at 9. I'm Dhammike Kanayaka. Now, the much-anticipated vials of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine arrived in the island this morning. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa officially received the first consignment of 500,000 doses of the Indian-manufactured vaccine flown in aboard a special Air India charter flight. The vaccine was distributed among 6 hospitals of the Western Province today to facilitate the start of the inoculation program tomorrow. Frontline health workers are set to receive the jab first. Starting from coming Saturday, the vaccination program will be implemented island-wide.
In view of the spread of the coronavirus COVID-19, the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine was approved for emergency use in Sri Lanka by the National Medicines Regulatory Authority. At the request of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Government of India decided to donate 500,000 doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to Sri Lanka. Made by the Serum Institute in Pune, the vaccine consignment was flown to the island via a special Air India charter flight. The AI-281 carrying the consignment arrived at the Bandaranaike International Airport at 11:45 this morning. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa arrived at the airport to officially receive the consignment donated by the Government of India. Indian High Commissioner Gopal Bagle handed over the vaccine to President Gotabaya at the airport.
On this very special day, shall we all put our hands together, ladies and gentlemen?
The President then handed over the stocks of vaccine to State Minister of COVID Disease Control, Dr. Sudarshini Fernando Pillai, and State Minister of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals, Professor Channa Jayasumana. The Indian High Commissioner also presented a memento to President Gotabaya to mark the occasion.
I'm very happy that the consignment of COVID vaccine made in India have arrived today in Sri Lanka. We are very grateful to His Excellency the President, who very graciously was at the airport when the consignment was handed over to the government of Sri Lanka. This gesture represents the strength of friendship between the two countries and their leadership. India will continue to work closely with Sri Lanka to fight COVID and for Sri Lanka's economic recovery.
Meanwhile, taking to Twitter, the Indian High Commission in Sri Lanka made note that the consignment of vaccine arrived in the country on a blessed Poya Day, which marks the first visit of Lord Buddha to Sri Lanka. The High Commissioner had also offered prayers at the sacred Gangarama temple for the good health and well-being of the people of Sri Lanka. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was then packed into refrigerated containers and transported to the Central Vaccine Store in Colombo. One of the vaccine samples was taken to the Borella Medical Research Institute. The vaccine was distributed to the Colombo National Hospital, Colombo North Teaching Hospital, Colombo South Teaching Hospital, Homagama Base Hospital, Colombo East Base Hospital and the IDH this afternoon. The inoculation program is scheduled to begin tomorrow at these designated hospitals.
අපි අද දවස තුලදීම බෙදා හැරීම පටන් ගන්නවා. හෙට දවස තුලදීම අපි බස්නාහිර පළාතේ ස්ථාන කිහිපයක එන්නත් ලබා දීම ආරම්භ කරනවා. හෙට දවස වෙනකොට අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා මේ රටේ දිස්ත්‍රික්කවල තියෙනවා ප්‍රාදේශීය එන්නත් ගබඩා. ඒ එන්නත් ගබඩා වලට මේ එන්නත් පිටත් කරන්න. එතනින් සෙනසුරාදා දවසේ සිට එන්නත් කිරීම අපේ රට තුල හැම දිස්ත්‍රික්කයකම ආරම්භ වෙනවා.
මුලින්ම ඉදිරිපෙළ සෞඛ්‍ය සේවකයන්ට තමයි එන්නත් ලබා දීම සිදු කරන්නේ. ඒ වගේම හෙට දිනේ ඇතුළතදීම ශ්‍රී ලංකා යුද හමුදාව මගිනුත් හමුදා ආරක්ෂක සේවයේ නියුතු අයටත් එන්නත් ලබා දීම සඳහා වැඩපිළිවෙල අප ආරම්භ කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. ඊළඟට ප්‍රමුඛතාව පිළිවෙල අනුව සිටින්නේ අවුරුදු 60ට වැඩි වෙනත් බෝ නොවන රෝගවලින් පෙළෙන හඳුනාගත් කණ්ඩායම්. ඔවුන්ට ලබා දීමේ කටයුතුත් ආරම්භ කරනවා. ලෝකේ දැනට නිෂ්පාදනය කරලා තියෙන COVID-19 සඳහා ලබා දෙන එන්නත් සියල්ල අතුරින්ම වඩාත්ම ආරක්ෂිත ඒ වගේම අතුරු ප්‍රතිඵල ඉතාම අඩුම එන්නත තමයි ඔක්ස්ෆර්ඩ් ඇස්ට්‍රාසෙනිකා එන්නත. ඒ තමයි අපේ රටට ලැබිලා තියෙන්නේ. රුසියානු ස්පුට්නික් එන්නත ශ්‍රී ලංකාවට ලබා ගැනීම සඳහා මේ වෙනකොට සාකච්ඡාවට ගණනාවක් පවත්වලා තියෙනවා. ලබන සඳුදා දිනේදී ඒ පිළිබඳ අවසන් එකඟතාවකට එන්න අප බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. ඇත්තටම අද දහවල් අතිගරු ජනාධිපතිතුමා සහ ඉන්දියානු මහ කොමසාරිස්තුමා සාකච්ඡා කරා. ඒ අවස්ථාවේදී අතිගරු ජනාධිපතිතුමා ඉල්ලීමක් කරා ඉන්දියානු මහ කොමසාරිස්තුමාගෙන් ඉදිරියේදී රටේ අනෙකුත් ජනතාවට ලබා දීමට අවශ්‍ය වන එන්නත් ප්‍රමාණය ඉන්දියාවේ පුණේ නගරයේ පිහිටි සීරියම් ආයතනයෙන් ලබා ගැනීම සඳහා අවශ්‍ය පහසුකම් සපයන්න කියලා. ආර්ථික වශයෙන් අපිට මේ වෙනකොට ශක්තියක් තියෙනවා. ඒ සඳහා මුදල් ප්‍රතිපාදන තියෙනවා. රටේ අනෙකුත් ජනතාවට අවශ්‍ය එන්නත් ලබා ගැනීම සඳහා.
Meanwhile, State Minister of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals, Professor Channa Jayasumana met with Chinese Ambassador to Sri Lanka, Ki Zhenhong, this afternoon. During the audience, paperwork related to the donation of Sinopharm vaccine by the Chinese government were exchanged.
Pay just 500,000 rupees to reserve your unit today. Mulberry Residence.
Meanwhile, Sri Lanka recorded its highest single-day COVID-19 recoveries today after 1,869 persons were given the all-clear to return to their daily lives. The previous single-day best was recorded yesterday, 349 less than today's figure. Though the recoveries today, or over the last 2 days I should say, have been high, so are the daily infections. The police say that rapid antigen testing units have been set up at 12 exit points of the western province in order to prevent the coronavirus from further spreading to other parts of the island.
Sri Lanka's daily COVID-19 infection numbers have been relatively high in recent times, even hitting the highest figure of 887 since the pandemic broke out in the country. And yesterday, 772 infections were recorded across the island, with 189 of them being confirmed from the Colombo district. Colombo had been the hotspot of COVID-19 during the second wave, and 28 of yesterday's infections came from Colombo 15. Meanwhile, 27 infections were reported from the area of Bambalapitiya, 24 from within the Colombo municipality, while Colombo 3 confirmed 23 cases. As for infection numbers in other districts, 178 cases were confirmed from the Gampar district, 93 from Kalutara, 62 from Kurunegala, 36 from Ampara, 23 from Ratnapura, while the district of Mathura confirmed 20 cases. A further 141 infections were confirmed from 14 other districts. The remaining 30 cases were identified as Sri Lankan expatriates. Meanwhile, 351 new COVID-19 infections have been confirmed so far today. In other developments, police media spokesperson DIG Ajit Rohana says that rapid antigen testing units have been set up at 12 exit points of the western province as a measure to prevent the spread of the virus further within the country.
බස්නාහිර පළාතෙන් පිටවන ස්ථාන 12කදී මේ මෙහෙයුම මේ වන විට පැවැත්වෙනවා. ඒ සඳහා ඔබගේ උපරිම සහාය අපේක්ෂා කරනු ලබනවා. මීට අමතරව බස්නාහිර පළාතේ විශේෂයෙන්ම කොළඹ නගරේ පොදු ස්ථාන ගාලුමෝදර පිටිය කොටුව පිටකොටුව ආශ්‍රිතව මහජනතාව හම්බු ලෙස රැපිඩ් ඇන්ටිජන් පරීක්ෂාවලට යොමු කිරීමේ මෙහෙයුම ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙනවා. ඊට අමතරව කොළඹින් ගමන් කරන දුර ගමන් සේවා බස් රථවල මගීන් සහ රියදුරන් කොන්දොස්තරවරුන් පරීක්ෂා කිරීමේ මෙහෙයුමත් ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙනු ලබනවා. ඊයේ දිනේ බස්නාහිර පළාත තුල පරිසර කොට්ටාශී නිලධාරීන් සහ සෞඛ්‍ය බලධාරීන් විසින් රාජ්‍ය නොවන ආයතන එවැගේම කර්මාන්ත ශාලා ආදිය සෞඛ්‍ය පුරුදු අනුගමනය කරන්නේ දැයි සොයා බැලීමේ මෙහෙයුම ක්‍රියාත්මක කරනු ලැබුවා. එවැනි ආයතන 830ක් පරීක්ෂාවට ලක් කරනු ලැබුවා. එම ආයතන 830න් ආයතන 71ක් එම සෞඛ්‍ය පුරුදු අනුගමනය නොකරන බවට පෙනී ගොස් තිබෙනවා. එම ආයතන 71 පරිපාලකයින්ට සුපරීක්ෂකයින්ට එරෙහිව අපි නඩු පැවරීමට කටයුතු කරනු ලබනවා.
In the meantime, with 2 more COVID-19 related fatalities reported yesterday, the country's total coronavirus death toll rose to 290. One of the victims was identified as a 43-year-old man residing in Colombo 15, whose cause of death was stated as COVID pneumonia and heart disease. The other victim was a 74-year-old woman, and she had died due to COVID pneumonia, kidney infection, and acute cellulitis. In another development, the Parliament's Sergeant-at-Arms Narendra Fernando said that random PCR tests are being carried out once a week for the staff of the Parliament at the parliamentary premises. All members of Parliament have also been invited to take part in the PCR tests. He said that with the support of the Department of the Director General of Health Services, these tests will be conducted once a week on both the sitting days as well as non-sitting days. In other developments, Sri Lanka recorded its highest ever daily COVID-19 recoveries today, as 1,869 persons being given the all-clear to return to their daily lives. This places the overall number of persons who recovered from the coronavirus in Sri Lanka at 54,435. This puts the island's total number of active COVID-19 cases at 6,320.
In the meantime, Sri Lanka has been placed in the top 10 among countries which have handled the COVID-19 pandemic more effectively. The COVID-19 Performance Index, compiled by the Lowy Institute of Australia, has ranked 98 countries with publicly available and comparable data on the virus based on how they managed the pandemic to date following their 100th confirmed case of COVID-19. The institute had categorized countries by regions, political systems, population size and economic development in order to determine if significant variations exist between the different ways the pandemic was handled by various countries. In index, New Zealand is ranked number 1, indicating the high efficacy in the country's ability to deal with the pandemic. The countries Vietnam and Taiwan came in 2nd and 3rd on the performance index. Sri Lanka, meanwhile, was ranked 10th. The United States, however, is placed towards the bottom of the index at 94, while India sits at 86th. China has not been included in the ranking due to the lack of publicly available data on testing. The Lowy Institute noted that no single type of country emerged the unanimous winner in the period examined, as variations between individual countries were far more substantial than those between broad categories of countries. Now, the annual report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights was released yesterday, in which Michelle Bachelet has arrived at some brutal conclusions and has given recommendations in kind. Excerpts, I should say, of the report were leaked to media last week, and the final version does not seem to be any different to the leaked version. It concludes that in addition to taking steps towards referral of the situation in Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court, member states can actively pursue investigations and prosecutions of international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka before their own national courts.
United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet puts forth 22 recommendations for the Sri Lankan government, the Human Rights Council and member states, as well as other United Nations entities, in her report on the country's human rights performance to be tabled before the February 24 country review at the 46th session of the UNHRC. In it, Bachelet concludes that Sri Lanka's current trajectory sets the scene for the recurrence of the policies and practices that gave rise to grave human rights violations. It says that Tamil and Muslim minorities are being increasingly marginalized and excluded from the national vision and government policy. Another conclusion of Bachelet is that the emergency security deployment that followed the Easter Sunday terrorist attacks in 2019 have evolved into an increasing militarization of the state and takes aim at the government's appointment of active and former military personnel, including those what the report calls are credibly implicated in war crimes, to key positions in the civilian administration. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights also alleges that the space for civil society, including independent media, is rapidly shrinking. The report says that the government has now demonstrated its inability and unwillingness to pursue a meaningful path towards accountability for international crimes and serious human rights violations, and signalled instead a fundamentally different approach which focuses on reparation and development but threatens to deny victims their rights to truth and justice and further entrench impunity. Bachelet goes on to say that in addition to taking steps towards a referral of the situation in Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court, member states can actively pursue investigation and prosecution of international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka before their own national courts, including under accepted principles of extraterritorial or universal jurisdiction. She concludes that the member states can also apply targeted sanctions such as asset freezes and travel bans against state officials and other actors credibly alleged to have committed or be responsible for grave human rights violations or abuses. Among her 11 recommendations to the Sri Lankan government, Bachelet calls for removal from office security personnel and other public officials who the report identifies as credibly implicated in human rights violations in compliance with human rights standards. She also calls for a moratorium on the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act for new arrests until it is replaced by legislation that adheres to international best practices. Establishment of standard procedures for the granting of pardons or other forms of clemency by the President, including subjecting it to judicial review and excluding grave human rights and international humanitarian law violations, is also recommended. Meanwhile, among Bachelet's 7 recommendations laid out for the Human Rights Council and member states, she requests the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to enhance its monitoring of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. What's more, she calls for stringent vetting procedures to Sri Lankan police and military personnel identified for military exchanges and training programs. Prioritization of support to civil society initiatives and efforts for reparation and victims' assistance, and prioritization of victims and their families for assistance in their bilateral humanitarian, development and scholarship programs is another recommendation. In the meantime, a total of 4 recommendations are made by UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet for United Nations entities. She wants UN agencies to ensure that all development programs in Sri Lanka are founded on principles of inclusion, non-discrimination and support for effective, accountable and inclusive institutions in line with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Incorporation of strict human rights due diligence in engagement with the security forces and all bodies under the purview of the Ministry of Defence or the Ministry of Public Security is also recommended. In the last recommendation, Bachelet notes that whilst fully understanding fourth-generation challenges in the context of UN peacekeeping, keep under review Sri Lanka's contributions to UN peacekeeping operations and screening systems for Sri Lanka personnel.
In other legal stories, Transparency International Sri Lanka is critical of the fact that Sri Lanka stagnated at the rank of 92 for a decade in the Corruption Perception Index. Addressing a media briefing today, its executive director also said that the COVID-19 vaccination program is at high risk of falling prey to corruption owing to the considerable flow of funds involved.
In this Corruption Perception Index of 2020, Sri Lanka has scored 38 out of 100, and our ranking among 180 countries is the 92nd place. And it is disheartening to note that Sri Lanka's score, this 38th score, has remained stagnant at this level for almost a decade. Over the past decade, we have successive governments who have pledged to work towards eradication eradicating corruption, and which means there has not been real change for all these efforts, which is why the experts and the private sector are still perceiving the public sector to have a high level of corruption. If we look at the initiative of the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery and corruption in 2019, launched the National Action Plan to eradicate corruption with a lot of consultations and very good recommendations. But we have not seen the progress of this National Action Plan. It had crucial elements such as bringing a legal framework to regulate campaign financing, which is where the story begins. And we do not see that commitment from the necessary stakeholders. And in terms of the recent policies such as no questions asked to deposit foreign currency, now these factors will affect the CPI or the Corruption Perception Index next year as well in our country. Now we hear that people are questioning what happened to all the COVID relief funds that we got. I think the fact that people are asking questions is a good thing, and it doesn't mean there is corruption, but it gives that space and opportunity for the government to inculcate and nurture a culture of transparency. If you look at the vaccination, it's going to be a high risk for corruption area with a lot of funds coming in.
Now, the Committee on Public Enterprises has instructed the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment to look into the possibility of repatriating migrant workers affected by COVID-19 using its own funds. This was mentioned during a meeting chaired by COPE Chairman Professor Charita Herath to look into the special audit report on the current situation in the field of foreign employment. The committee inquired into any legal impediments to the repatriation of Sri Lankan workers from various countries who have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic using the Foreign Employment Bureau's current assets of 14 billion rupees. The Foreign Employment Bureau chairman had responded that there is no obstacle to repatriating foreign workers registered with the body to Sri Lanka using their own funds. A total of 34,721 workers who lost their jobs due to the fall of oil prices in the Middle East and the pandemic situation have already requested the Foreign Employment Bureau to repatriate them. Now, former parliamentarian of the United National Party, Navin Disanayake, says that party reforms not meeting expectations led to him rejecting the national organizer position offered to him by the party. Former MP Arjuna Ranatunga had also refused to accept the position offered to him, and he insists that a change in party leadership is essential in moving forward.
The Working Committee of the United National Party appointed office bearers for 2021 on the 13th of January without changing the party leadership, which is presently held by former PM Ranil Wickremesinghe. What's more, former parliamentarian Arjuna Ranatunga was appointed as the senior vice chairman of the party. However, in a letter to the party leader yesterday, Ranatunga rejected the position. The letter says that he remained in the party following the election defeat in hope that a suitable program to achieve the challenges faced by the party at present and in the future would materialize. He, however, said that such a program has not manifested. He also added that he rejected the position offered to him since the party has failed to put forth a program for Sri Lanka's future betterment. In the meantime, former parliamentarian Navin Disanayake has also rejected the position of national organizer offered to him.
සජාතික පක්ෂයේ ජාතික සංවිධායක ධූරයට පසුගිය කෘත්‍යාධිකාරී මණ්ඩලයේ රැස්වීමේදී මා පත් කළත් එය මම බාර ගැනීම ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කළා. එම ධූරය පක්ෂයේ වෙනත් කෙනෙකුට ලබා දීම කෙරෙහි මගේ අකමැත්තක් නොමැති බව ඒ ලිපියෙන් කියා සිටියා. මම තවදුරටත් එක්සත් ජාතික පක්ෂයේ සමාජිකයෙක් පක්ෂයෙන් ඉවත් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ වගේම කෘත්‍යාධිකාරී මණ්ඩලයේ සමාජිකත්වයේ දිගටම දරනවා. පක්ෂයේ ජාතික සංවිධායක ධූරයෙන් ඉවත් වීමට මූලිකත්වයේ හේතුව වූයේ පක්ෂයේ ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ අපේක්ෂිත මට්ටමින් සිදු නොවීම. නමුත් පක්ෂයේ නායකත්වය දැන් අපි නව දිශාවකට යොමු කළ යුතුයි. නව යෝජනා ඉදිරිපත් කළා. නමුත් එම යෝජනා හෝ ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ සාධනීය ලෙස සලකා බැලුනේ නැහැ.
මමත් තීරණයක් ගත්තා. මට ලබලා දීලා තිබුණා ජ්‍යෙෂ්ඨ උප සභාපති ධූරයක්. පොදු විපක්ෂයක් අවශ්‍යයි. කතා කරන විපක්ෂයක් නෙමෙයි, හරි විදියට වැඩක් කරන විපක්ෂයක්. අපි එකට එකහුව වෙලා අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම ඉදිරියේදී ආණ්ඩුවක් හදන්නේ වැඩපිළිවෙලකට අපි එකහුව වෙනවා. මම ඉදිරියේදී තීරණය කරනවා මම කොයි විදිහටද දේශපාලනය කරන්න කියලා.
ඔබතුමා හිතන විදිහට එක්සත් ජාතික පක්ෂයේ ජයග්‍රහණය කරා ගෙනියන්න පුළුවන්ද මේ නායකත්වය තුලින් ඉදිරියේදී?
මම හිතන්නේ අපිට අලුත් වෙනසක් තමයි මේ රටේ වාක ඉල්ලුවේ. එක්සත් ජාතික පක්ෂිකයන් ඉල්ලුවේ වෙනසක්. ඉතින් ඒක මම හිතන්නේ හරියට උනේ නැති එක ප්‍රශ්නයක්.
පක්ෂ පරාජයෙන් පසුව රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ එතුමාම ප්‍රකාශ කරා එතුමා පක්ෂ නායකත්වයෙන් අයින් වෙනවා කියලා. දැන් පක්ෂයේ පරාජය වෙලා අගෝස්තු 10 වගේ දවසක කරු ජයසූරිය මැතිතුමාගේ නිවසට ඉස්සෙල්ලාම ආවේ පාලිතරංග බණ්ඩාර මහතා. ඇවිල්ලා කිව්වා ඔබතුමා පක්ෂ නායකත්වය බාර ගන්න කියලා. පාලිතරංග බණ්ඩාර මහතා අද පක්ෂයේ මහලේකම්. එතකොට අර කිව්ව දේවල් ඔක්කොම එතුමාට අමතක වෙලාද? අපි කියන්නේ මේ තනතුරු වලට සිලෙක්ට් කරන්න නැතුව ඉලෙක්ෂන්ස් තියන්න කියලා.
දැන් මේ වෙනකොට නවීන් දිසානායක මැතිතුමා සහ ආතුරු රන්තුගේ මැතිතුමා ඇයි මේ එක්සත් ජාතික පක්ෂයත් එක්ක විරසකයක් ඇති වෙලාද?
විරසකයක් නෙමෙයි. ඉතින් ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ යම්කිසි පොඩි ගැටලු වගේක් තියෙනවා ඇති. ඉතින් ඒක මම හිතනවා නායකතුමාත් එක්ක සාකච්ඡා කරලා ඒව විසඳ ගන්න පුළුවන්. කනගාටුවක් හැටියට කියන්නට ඕනේ දැන් විපක්ෂයේ කට්ටිය ඔක්කොම නිකන් හැමතැනම බෙදිලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ කට්ටිය ඔක්කොම එකතු වෙන්න ඕනේ. දැන් ඊළඟ ජනාධිපති වෙන්නේ කවුද කියන එක නෙවෙයි. රටේ ජනතාව ගැන හිතලා රට ගැන හිතලා සියලු දෙනාම එකතු වෙන්නට ඕනේ මේ අවස්ථාවේදී.
We will see you soon. Welcome back. This is First at 9. Now, President-elect of the National Chamber of Commerce, Nandika Buddhipala, says that Sri Lanka should give more emphasis to the positive patterns of global trade growth rather than growth depressions. He made these remarks during the annual general meeting of the National Chamber of Commerce held in Colombo recently.
As some research agencies highlighted that the domestic debt, which is estimated to have around 50% of the total debt burden of the government, used to attract more than 70% of the total interest cost of the government. Therefore, we infer that keeping local interest rate down would not only help the local enterprises to facilitate sustainability of their businesses, but it will help the government to manage debt burden as well. Another global research report published predicts that Sri Lanka would bounce back impressively, and in fact that is the biggest upgrade to their forecast they made recently. They further observed that mainland China, Taiwan, Vietnam and Korea as well as Sri Lanka has seen among fastest increase in shipments, with others lagging behind. They expected the mainland China, Sri Lanka and Taiwan, Vietnam would start 2021 either at or above the level of activity before breakout of pandemic-19. They expect Sri Lanka GDP is likely to grow by quite astonishing amount by 7% year on year 2021, largely due to the base effect since they estimated 5% drop in GDP during 2020. The CBSL policy rate cut by 250 basis points, bringing down the standard lending facility rate SLFR to 550, has been fully transmitted through lending rates easing off by 280 basis points. However, the view that the public debt sustainability is amongst the biggest risks for Sri Lanka for the next 5 years.
The President-elect of the National Chamber of Commerce, Nandika Buddhipala, is of the view that Sri Lanka should focus more on the positive trends of global trade growth while being mindful of the depressed state of the service sector.
As a result of closure of entry points to countries, global trade collapsed last year and supply disruptions interrupted the international provision of goods and services. It is observed that the goods trade fell more rapidly and recovered more swiftly than during the global financial crisis that we observed in 2008-9. But unfortunate thing is service trade remains depressed. But we know as an economy we have about 60% coming from the service sector, so we need to be mindful of that. But it is expected that the global trade growth would experience a strong recovery, averaging nearly 7% over 21 and 22. It's a good phenomena. So we need not to be kind of looking at the depression and saying that it is only depressed by 10%, 9%. We need to look at moving forward. All this data, including rating agencies who have downgraded us, saying that even Sri Lanka has potential. So we'll look at it and we'll look at it positively, and we'll see what we can do as chambers to support that development in the country.
Former Sri Lanka cricketer Dilhara Lokuhettige has been found guilty of 3 offences under the ICC Anti-Corruption Code following a hearing by an independent anti-corruption tribunal. Now, Lokuhettige was charged under the ICC Anti-Corruption Code in November 2019, has been found guilty on all charges after he exercised his right to a hearing before a tribunal. Accordingly, he has been found guilty of being party to an agreement or effort to fix or contrive or otherwise influence improperly the result, progress, conduct or other aspect of a match. He was also found guilty for directly or indirectly soliciting, inducing, enticing, instructing, persuading, encouraging or intentionally facilitating any participant to breach Code Article 2.1. What's more, the tribunal has found Loku Hettige guilty of failing to disclose to the anti-corruption unit details of any approaches or invitations received to engage in corrupt conduct under the code. And that's it from all of us here at First at 9. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.